When I'm on my deathbed, I don't want to have to ask myself, well, what if I had? What if I had come out earlier? What if I had done this that I wish I had done? So I'm trying to live my life not having to ask myself that question.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. This show comes out every other Monday, and you can find more episodes and complete show notes at grayingrainbows.com. You can also send me feedback via email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com or voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. Today's episode is an interview with Warren Blumenfeld, a veteran of the early fight for LGBT rights. His story is a firsthand reminder of how far things have come, but also a reminder that we can't take this progress for granted. I'll be back after the interview to review a few key ideas and to tell you how you can win an Amazon gift certificate. My guest today is Warren Blumenfeld. Warren, it's great to have you on Graying Rainbows.
It's great being here.
So the format of this show is that people usually just start out by sharing their stories. Do you feel comfortable doing that?
I sure do.
So take it away.
Okay. Well, I was born in 1947. It was a very, very conservative time in U.S. history, even in some ways more conservative than today. It was the beginning of the Cold War and the rise of what was called the McCarthy period, when difference of any sort was held suspect in the United States. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, a brash Senator McCarthy from Wisconsin got up and he said basically that communists corrupt the minds and homosexuals corrupt the bodies of good, upstanding Americans. And he proceeded to purge suspected homosexuals and communists from government service. There was not only what was called the Red Scare, but also the Lavender Scare, that in some ways he equated communists and degenerates, aka homosexuals, as corrupting American society, American government. I mean, in some ways, just as Trump is using immigrants today in the same fear-mongering that McCarthy was using communists and homosexuals in the late 40s, early 50s, throughout the 50s. So this is the environment in which I was raised and born into. It was also a time of strict gender role conforming, that any sign of gender difference was immediate cause, in some ways, for parents, school teachers, the society in general, to really reinforce these rigid gender roles. Many of the gender roles relaxed during the war because of the need for employees in industry and also for recruits into the military. So women were given many more opportunities than they had previously been given because of the need for employees in industry and into the military. But right after the war, there was a reinstatement, a re-hardening of gender roles. So I was born in 47, and my mother told me by the age of 18 months or 2 years that I was exhibiting, as she called it, feminine qualities. The language then was very oppressive. She said I was effeminate at age, 18 months. And by age 2, my parents really thought that I might be gay. They were equating eventual sexual identity or sexual orientation with gender role performance, which, as we know, is not equated. but they were equating the two. So by the age of 4, in 1951, my parents started sending me to a child psychologist twice a week for the next 8 years. I was taken out of my classes when I was in elementary school and taken to the psychotherapist twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. I even remember Dr. Wheeler. And there was a basic pattern to the therapy. Walk into the therapist's office. I didn't even know why I was there. My mother called him the toy doctor because we built toys or played with toys. At age 4, 5, 6, you don't know what this person is, why you're going there. So I would take off my hat and coat and put it on the hook behind the door. And then he would ask me if I would like to talk to him about anything. And I didn't know why I was there. So he proceeded to take down from the shelf a model airplane or a boat or a truck or whatever. And we would proceed to build with glue and wood, this model airplane or whatever. He tried to get me to play, quote unquote, with toys that boys usually play with, cars and planes and little toy soldiers. And he thought that if I behaved more in line with my gender, that maybe I might in some ways grow up more masculine or whatever. I don't know. Mm-hmm. He told my parents, make sure that he doesn't wash or dry the dishes, which was great because I didn't like doing that anyway. And, to this day, my sister still resents me because she had to do it every night instead of every other night. Yeah. He also said, make sure that he mows the lawn. Well, we were working class and lived in a tenement building. We didn't have a lawn, but I was supposed to mow it anyway. By the time I was 13, my parents said, well, you can decide whether you continue going or not. And I don't want to go and see this man twice a week. By then, I knew why I was going. I was acting out or being myself, and I get the message, and I wasn't acting out anything. I was just being myself, that I was getting the message that there was something wrong with me, and I internalized my own homophobia, that I started learning you hide your mannerisms, you hide your desires. By age 6, I was attracted to other boys, but no one told me, don't come out of the closet. You get these messages very easily. And, I tried to pass, which I couldn't really do. I tried to date girls in high school, and, girls were my best friends, but I wasn't romantically or physically attracted to them. But I lived a lie until in college I finally came out. Even though I did have, a few boyfriends in high school, I couldn't be out to anyone but them. This was, before the Stonewall riots, which is credited as being the beginning of the modern gay rights movement, even though there was a movement before that time. This was when it became more visible. And then I joined the Gay Liberation Front when I was 1970. I joined the Gay Liberation Front at my college. And then I moved to Washington, D.C., and was a member of the Gay Liberation Front then. And I became very, very political in the late 60s, early 70s. And then from then, I've just been a social justice advocate for the rest of my life.
Will you talk a little bit about what it was like to be out in those early days when a lot of the leadership still, was arguing for a different approach?
In the early 1950s, there was the beginning of what was called the Mattachine Society, which was a men's group, and the Daughters of Bilitis, which was a women's group. This was a part of what was called then the homophile movement, homo meaning same and phile meaning love of sameness. At the beginning, the Mattachine Society was very radical and very in your face, but there was a power struggle in the Mattachine Society, and the more conservative elements took over and purged the more radical members. So it became a very we are like you kind of movement. If you even see some of the early demonstrations, in the late 50s and the 60s, early 60s, you do have demonstrations at the White House, and then the annual reminder, which was at Independence Hall every 4th of July, saying that it was called homosexual, that we didn't have the terms. We had the terms, but, gay and lesbian wasn't really used as much. Homosexual rights are human rights. And there was this mandate that people in the demonstrations had to wear, for the men, business suits, and women had to wear dresses. If they see us as just like them, they'll give us our rights kind of attitude. Versus the new generation from around 1969 onward, which was we are who we are, we're not going to conform to mainstream standards. And there was a tension between the different factions of the movement. And eventually, those of us in the gay liberation movement of the late 60s, early 70s, really brought to the public's attention that we're not necessarily just like you. And my attitude was, what we do in bed is more in common with heterosexuals than the way that we are in the society, that we are hated, that we are marginalized. So it's more that we perceive the society differently because of our minoritized status. The good thing about our movement was that it transcended sexuality, it transcended gender identity and expression, it transcended race, it transcended religion, that we were a member of all these intersectional groups at the time. We also saw that one of the contributing factors to the oppression of marginalized groups was in the basic flaws in the capitalist system, which pitted groups against each other rather than unifying these groups to fight against the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege in the society. So at an early stage, we really came out of the women's movement, who had this capitalist critique of the society, and it really resonated with those of us who were marginalized on the basis of our sexuality and our gender expression as well. So we really had a more radical interpretation or idea that we really needed to transform the entire system, that we weren't just working for the rights of what would later be called LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, but we saw our stake linking with, and we were active supporters of the Black Panthers movement, which saw the oppression of Black people, that we were sometimes criticized from some of the more conservative members of the LGBT movement. And it wasn't called LGBT then, but I'm using more of the contemporary terminology. We were criticized for aligning ourselves with the Black Power movement, with the Black is Beautiful movement, with the disability rights movement. We were more than a single ism movement, that we saw the oppression of many movements. And in the early 70s, we really saw a distinct split between, say, the gay liberation movement and what was called the Gay Activist Alliance, which was more single issue, which was great, that we needed all of these different segments of the movement, that there wasn't one way to accomplish the goal of reducing oppression and equalizing the rights of people within the United States. So we really saw the different aspects, different movements joining together to fight oppression on many different fronts.
From your standpoint as being a person who was inside the action, so to speak, what do you see as being the key events that have happened over the last several decades?
One of the greatest things is that younger people are coming out of the closet at earlier and earlier ages than ever before. I see that as very exciting, that yes, oppression still exists, but I'm seeing that younger people are growing up with healthier more positive senses of self than those of us who are older did. I'm seeing them challenging oppression, but also I don't see as much internalized oppression because they grew up in times that were somewhat more relaxed, somewhat more supported. And I see parents supporting their youth at earlier and earlier ages. And I really am seeing also that the transgender movement is so powerful in that it frees us all up to express our gender in many different ways. And because of the transgender movement, I've come out. I mean, coming out is a lifelong experience that, for the longest time I considered myself a gay man, but I never related to the word man. That whole binary of gender to me was always something I didn't relate to. When I'm walking down the street, with my dog on a leash and, someone comes up to, "Oh, what a cute dog. Your father must be so proud of you, little dog." He said, "Father." I never considered myself male or female or man or a woman. I might come across as kind of a cisgender male, but the term male never fit me. So I've come out of another closet calling myself agender. The whole concept of gender to me is a social construction. We are all expressive of who we are, but why do we have to put a label? That's masculine, or that's feminine, or that's male, or that's female, or that's effeminate, or that's this or that. This is, the motto we had in the Gay Liberation Front, and earlier probably, that labels are appropriate for jars and not for people. And that's what the transgender movement has really, I think, freed, if people will accept the gifts that the trans movement has given us, it has freed us up from these labels and from these definitions and from the compulsion to label. I consider myself a queer agender person. Queer is basically a label that is deconstructing labels. Queer can mean anything. To me, queer means non-normative and revolutionarily non-normative. I teach queer studies courses, and students are saying, "Why are you using the term queer? That was taken as an epithet." Well, yeah, it was taken as an epithet, but it means different from the norm. And anything that's different from the norm is considered bad or evil even. But we've reclaimed the word queer in a positive way as a sign in academia, as a critical analysis of a society that marginalizes difference, and we've reclaimed it as a positive aspect. So I'm a queer agender person and proud. And when people ask me what that means, different from the norm, and it's a way of deconstructing labels. Queer is a label that deconstructs labels. Agender is a label that deconstructs labels. In this country and in many countries, we see this binary of us versus them, right versus wrong, left versus right. And what this does, it separates people and it prevents progressive social change by having these groups compete for a limited slice or even crumbs of a limited pie rather than us joining together to demand a larger pie.
I just want to take a moment to remind you to subscribe to Graying Rainbows in your favorite podcasting app. Also, if you use Facebook, don't forget to visit the Graying Rainbows Facebook page. And if you would like to interact privately with other listeners, be sure to request to join our private Facebook group. I don't know very much about queer studies, but I read, I guess it was a graphic introduction to queer studies.
Oh, yeah.
baby book.
Yeah,
But I learned a
love it.
lot because I knew nothing. One of the concepts that came through was what you just mentioned, the idea of gender as a cultural construction.
Yes.
My question is, I mean, I know because I've done a show about brain science for a long time, that we start teaching people gender from the time they're in the cradle. So that I know is true. But at the same time, I wonder about, some people seem to be particularly drawn in one direction or another, like somebody who is born, looks like a boy, but wants to play with girl things and wear girl things, and vice versa, somebody who looks like a girl but really feels male. How do you fit that into the cultural construction part? I mean, it feels to me like there's some bit of it that must be innate.
I think innateness is expression, but society labels that expression. And society says that basically all males should express this way and all females should express this way. I think there's a combination of nature and nurture. Many trans people say that, and many gay and lesbian and bisexual people said they were born gay or they were born trans. I don't know, maybe I was born naturally attracted to males, some males. Many of my trans friends say from the earliest ages, I felt I was in the body of another sex, and that's fine. I think that is a large part of it. But identities are manufactured. Identities are socially there is no such thing as race. Race is a social construction that was invented by white Europeans in the 15th century in order to justify domination and exploitation of peoples around the world. We can see some of the earliest constructions of Carl Linnaeus and who was considered to be the father of scientific racism, that there is no gene for race. There is a gene for how much melanin you have in your skin, or there's genes for hair texture and color. There's genes for, your facial features and all that. But there is no gene for race. Race is dependent on where your ancestors migrated to from the African continent. Because we're all, basically, right. We're African. And then our skin color and what it was dependent on how far away we were from the equator, how much sun was entering our bodies for vitamin D. Okay. So when we look at all these traits, a race was invented. It's an idea. It's a myth. Likewise, the things about gender, these are roles that are given to us. These are scripts that are given to us when we enter the stage of life. They were written long ago. They were acted out by other actors before we came here, and then they were given to us to act out and reiterate over and over and over again. And by the time they continue, it seems as normal, because we lost the antecedents. We lost the ways that earlier actors had written these. At one time, pink was considered to be masculine and blue was considered to be feminine. Now it's the opposite. Look at the French in the 17th century. These men were wearing these frilly shirts and had more makeup than the women and had the coiffures of their hair and whatever. And today that's considered feminine and feminine. So it really depends on the time and the place of when these roles were constructed and reiterated. And they're constantly changing. So that's why I'm saying that in the gender roles are socially constructed. I might be in the wrong body. I think that might be more physical. That could be more physical than the roles that we play. Many trans people are now non-binary trans people. They're not getting into the expressions that our society is saying is appropriate for a certain gender. So they might feel that maybe their bodies, and many younger trans people are not going through the gender confirmation surgeries that their older peers are going through. They're expressing their gender, which is more inimicable and essential to them without having to conform to the binaries of masculine, feminine, male, or female. And that's why I believe that they are, a trans movement is doing us a great service in saying that gender is socially constructed and the way that you express your gender is appropriate to you. And that's what queer theory is, that there is no one way to perform gender, that we're looking at individuals expressing gender which is appropriate and inimicable and essential to them, and that's what the transgender movement has shown us and is doing today.
Yeah, and the other thing I got out of that book was the importance of fluidity, that gender expression can be fluid. I mean, that really ties into the whole idea that coming out is an ongoing process.
Right.
I mean, I've talked to quite a few guests who have, had that experience. Do you have anything that you would say to an older person, say somebody even your age or older who maybe because of their situation lived their life as a straight person but wants to consider the other options? What would you say to them?
I've been asked this question before, and the first thing that pops into my mind, I keep thinking of, when I'm on my deathbed, I don't want to have to ask myself, well, what if I had? What if I had come out earlier? What if I had done this that I wish I had done? So I'm trying to live my life not having to ask myself that question. When I was 47 years old, I went back to get my doctorate degree. I didn't get my doctorate degree until I was 54. And people were saying to me, you're going to be over 50 when you get your doctorate degree, when I was thinking about going back. And I said, yeah, I'll be over 50 anyway without my doctorate degree. Yeah. And then I was a professor starting age 54. And I don't have to ask myself on my deathbed, what if I had got my doctorate degree when I was in my 50s? I don't have to ask myself that question. I don't have to ask myself, well, what if I had come out of the closet and lived my life authentically at such and such an age? I don't have to ask myself that because I did it. So I would say to anyone, what do you not want to have to ask yourself on your deathbed if you had taken the risk? Because sometimes it is a risk. Sometimes you might lose some friends. You might lose family members. But at the same time, you'll gain so many more support system when you take a risk and act like yourself.
I think this idea of fluidity is important because say a person who's a widow, I'm a widow and I came out after my husband died. I don't really want to look back at my life and say, well, I was pretending to be straight, because my experience of it was that was where I was. And I think that's an important thing to say. I think I should be able to say when I was straight and not have somebody say, well, you were just pretending or denying your authentic self. Because
that's not the way it was. Right.
Right.
I knew I was gay at age 6. If I had gotten married and lived a lie, that's what I'm talking about. Being integral and genuine is the point. I can't talk for you, but it sounds like you were being integral and genuine all those years when you were married. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying when you are trying to be genuine, how do you do that and not have to regret not doing that? Genuine is such a difficult thing in a world of conformity. I taught this educational psychology course, 320 students. And one day we were just being really genuine. And I symbolically took off my professor hat and I put on the real person hat. Professors are real people. But I said, we're just going to talk here. And I sat down in front of them on a chair. I said, look, let's just be really genuine. Get rid of your student hat. I'll get rid of my professor hat. Let's just sit here like people. And then I talked about genuineness. What does it look like for someone just to be genuine, who they are, right here and now? Let's not think about the past. Let's not think about the future. Who are we right now? And I had them, pair up into groups, and I said, who are you? I said, this following question, and you complete the sentence. And I gave them the beginning of the sentence, and I said, just think about the first things that come to your mind, how you would complete that sentence. And the sentence was, I am ... And then this glow on their face came, and they sat with one another and shared some of these intimate details that they had never shared with people. I am a rape survivor. I am living a lie. I am someone who doesn't want to be in college, but I'm doing it for my parents. So we had this wonderful discussion. And then this one young woman was crying. And she put up her hand and she said, this is the first time I'm allowed to be genuine in my whole life. To be genuine is we have such a need and a hunger, but we put on there was an early Mattachine person Harry Hay was one of the founders of Mattachine Society, and he was one of more the progressive aspects of the Mattachine. And he talks about this ugly green frog skin of conformity that we walk around with throughout our days. And what would it be like to peel off this green, I don't know where he got the term frog skin, but what would it be to take off this ugly green frog skin and just be ourselves? Even when I was reading that in a book, I started breathing from the diaphragm. We're not allowed to be genuine because genuine means that we're not all the same, that we're different, that we can just be ourselves. And that's scary to the power structure for us just to be ourselves. So I try, I'm 71 now, and I'm at a point in my life that I don't, care if people think I'm that different anymore. But, I have the luxury of doing that because I am a professor and I can kind of just be myself. But what would it be like for people just to be genuine? And I remember that day in the class, and I think the students will remember it for the rest of their lives because it cut down these barriers and these labels, these roles that we have to play. And that's how I'm trying to live my life. It's hard in this society of conformity and fear of difference, but I try every day just to be genuine.
Are you still teaching?
I'm teaching now online. I teach about 4 or 5 courses a year online. It's called Diversity in Education, and I also teach an LGBT in education course for the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Occasionally I do workshops. I have this 4-part module on dealing with internalized oppression, all the different types of internalized oppression. It's so much easier for us to fight the oppression from outside rather than to look in ourselves and see how our internalized oppression limits our daily functioning. It's hard, and it's an ongoing process, but it's necessary.
So would you say that internalized oppression, does it have any connection to the problem of implicit bias or unconscious bias?
It does in terms of unconscious bias against members of our own group, because you've internalized that something is wrong with you, so people in your group, there's something wrong with them as well. Internalized oppression and internalized dominance, that we have internalized, sometimes unconsciously, the feeling that our group is better than another group, that our race is better than another race, that our sexuality is better than another person's sexuality. And we are given those early messages by our socialization. There's a cycle of socialization that my friend Bobby Harrow has developed a graphic for about the ways that we subtly and not so subtly internalize the social messages that we are taught in the society. I mean, there's a great song in South Pacific by Rodgers and Hammerstein, and it talks about some of the lines. We are consciously taught to hate people who are different from ourselves, and from an early age, we're taught to hate. We are taught how to act according to our gender and our race. We internalize those messages, both the ways that we are oppressed and the ways that we are dominant, because every person has an intersectional set of identities. Some of our identities are considered more dominant in a society. Some identities are considered more marginalized or subordinated in society. And we have to look at the ways that all of these identities intersect and our positionality in the world. We need to understand that positionality in the ways that we are multifaceted, that we are acting out our dominance or we are acting out our internalized oppression.
Warren, what else would you like to share with my listeners before we close?
That these are my thoughts. I cannot speak for all LGBT people. My experience is my experience. And if you talk to someone else, they might have totally different opinions, viewpoints, perspectives, and coming out experiences as well. So I can only talk for myself as a 71-year-old queer, agender person who's trying to live with integrity and be genuine.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me and share some of your life experience. One of my goals is to get more older guests on the show. So I really, of course, you're actually in the young end of the spectrum, really. I mean, young people think that 71 is old, but I think 71 is pretty young, actually. But from my perspective as a physician, it's funny how old gets younger, or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Those ages you used to. Well, you were a radical back in the days when they were saying don't trust anyone over 30.
Oh, I know. It's true. It's true. At some point, you might want to talk about other kinds of oppression like ageism and adultism. Within my own community, there's a lot of ageism in terms of younger people distrusting older people and older people not giving younger people enough credit and looking down on them. So that's a major issue, I think, in many, many communities and in the society at large.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's driving this podcast is that I think it's very important to have both generations or many generations talking to each other. But right now, the LGBT movement seems to be very youth-dominated. And for those of us who aren't youths, and eventually what I want to do with my show is move into activism for elders, because I'm very concerned about the issues of housing and healthcare access that elders are facing. But right now I'm taking the show kind of where I am on my path is thinking there's got to be other people out there that are at the beginning of this process, and I want them to know they're not alone.
Oh, yeah. We're all different, but our experience transcends ourselves. And thank you so much. I feel quite honored to be asked.
I want to thank Warren Blumenfeld for taking time to share his story. And he asked me to tell you about his new book, The What, The So What, and The Now What of Social Justice Education. You'll find a link to this book in the show notes at grayingrainbows.com. By the way, our new website is up, but I need to do more work on the resources page. If you have suggestions of books or other resources, be sure to send them to me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com. Whenever you start a new podcast, there's always a time lag before you start to get any email feedback. But now I am starting to hear from people, and I want to share some of this feedback with you. Recently, I got an email from Anna from South Australia. She wrote, Just wanted to say thank you for your podcast. I'm recently out at age 34. I recently ended a heterosexual marriage and I have 2 young kids. I'm probably a bit younger than your target age, but I think my experiences are similar to many of those who come out in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond. Your podcast has provided me with so much information regarding history, language, and the ongoing struggles for us LGBT plus folk. When I wrote back to Anna to get her permission to quote her email, she told me that she had read The Gay Revolution by Lillian Faderman after hearing her back in episode 1. So please do send me your email. And if you are willing to let it be read on air, I need to know, do you want to be called by your first name or where you're from or what identifying information you do or do not want me to use. I have no problem with anonymous if the email's worth sharing. But if you're willing to share a little bit about like where you're from, I think it will help others. I mentioned earlier the Grain Rainbows Facebook page and our private Facebook group, but I also want to mention that you can find me on Twitter as @grayingr. That's graying plus the capital R. Finally, I hope you find this show helpful and will share it with others. Besides subscribing, you can help the show grow by posting a review in iTunes. If you send me a screenshot of your review, grainrainbows@gmail.com, you will automatically be eligible for an Amazon gift card. Since we've gone to every other Monday, I will be back in 2 weeks with a new interview with historian Lillian Faderman. Until then, check out my other podcasts, Brain Science and Books and Ideas, and I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Grain Rainbows is copyright Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grainrainbows@gmail.com.